Personalized nutrition holds real promise on paper, tailoring advice to a person's genes, gut microbes, and metabolic phenotype could, in theory, blunt the worst effects of ultra-processed diets by identifying individual vulnerabilities and targeting precise interventions. But the reality right now is messier, riskier, and far less reassuring than many commercial tests and wellness influencers imply. Genetics, the microbiome, and metabolic profiling can give useful signals, but they are partial, noisy, and too often overstated. Worse, when these imperfect tools are presented as silver bullets, they can encourage people to keep relying on ultra-processed foods while outsourcing responsibility to a test, exactly the opposite of what's needed to prevent overeating and metabolic disease. Below, I examine how each biological axis can inform personalized strategies and why heavy caution is required. Genetics offers clues but rarely clear prescriptions. Common variants, FTO, MC4R, and others identified by GWS, are associated with higher BMI, appetite traits, or food reward sensitivity, and rare monogenic forms of obesity show that biology can overwhelmingly determine eating behavior in some people. In practice, the vast majority of genetic signals are probabilistic and low penetrance. They shift risk by a few percent and interact heavily with environment. A person with an at-risk genotype may never become obese on a whole foods diet, while another with a neutral genotype can develop severe metabolic disease on a chronic ultra-processed diet. Some nutrigenetic findings are more actionable, variants that influence lipid responses to saturated fat or caffeine metabolism, for example, but translating a handful of SNPs into a dietary program that reliably prevents overeating is currently speculative. Using genetics to justify continued consumption of processed foods, my genes made me do it, is a pernicious misuse. The honest message: genetics can explain differences in susceptibility and help prioritize monitoring, e.g., earlier glucose or lipid screening in higher-risk people, but it does not absolve the primary harm of ultra-processed diets, nor reliably dictate a one-size-fits-all food plan. The gut microbiome is prettier as a promise and far more seductive for consumers, and it has more plausible mechanisms linking it to appetite regulation, energy harvest, inflammation, and even reward signaling. Microbial composition affects short-chain fatty acid, SCFA, production, bile acid metabolism, and gut barrier integrity. Dysbiosis can increase lipopolysaccharide, LPS, translocation, and systemic inflammation, amplifying insulin resistance and cravings. In principle, microbiome profiling could identify people who lack butyrate-producing taxa and target them with high-fiber diets or specific prebiotics. In practice, the science is immature. Inter-individual variability is huge. Many microbiome tests use inconsistent methods and questionable reference ranges, and cause-effect is hard to prove. Interventions that look promising in small trials, tailored prebiotic blends, specific probiotics, or fermented foods, often produce modest, short-lived benefits and are highly context-dependent. Diet, medications, age, and prior exposures matter. Fecal microbiota transplant shows dramatic outcomes for some conditions, but is not a general fix for diet-induced overeating and carries risks. The biggest danger is commercial overreach, people paying for microbial blueprints and expecting a pill or powder to neutralize decades of ultra-processed eating. The sober truth: improving the microbiome through whole food, fiber-rich diets is effective, but personalized microbial prescriptions remain exploratory rather than curative. Metabolic phenotyping, measuring insulin sensitivity, fasting glucose lipid responses, resting metabolic rate, and even using continuous glucose monitors, CGMs, is the most directly actionable axis right now. If someone is demonstrably insulin resistant, interventions that reduce postprandial glucose spikes, lowering glycemic load, adding protein/fiber, altering meal timing, are sensible and evidence-based. CGMs can reveal which foods provoke the worst glucose excursions in an individual, and that feedback can motivate behavior change. Similarly, measures of glycemic variability, triglyceride responses, or fat oxidation rates can help prioritize diet and exercise prescriptions. But these tools also have a dark side. They can create obsessional monitoring, induce anxiety, and, if used in isolation, lead to reductionist advice, e.g., avoid carbs entirely, that neglects broader nutritional quality. And metabolic testing cannot make ultra-processed food harmless. It can only reveal and mitigate physiological damage once exposure occurs. Putting these axes together into individualized strategies can be powerful, but only if framed correctly and ethically. Practical, cautious, evidence-based approaches include: prioritize risk stratification, not exemption. Use genetics and metabolic tests to identify people who need earlier screening or more aggressive prevention, e.g., earlier HbA1c and lipid panels for those with familial risk, but do not treat genetic risk as fate. Make whole foods the foundation. Regardless of genotype or microbiome, shifting calories from ultra-processed products to minimally processed foods, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, intact proteins, nuts/seeds, fermented foods, has the largest, most reproducible benefit. Personalization only tweaks this baseline. Use targeted metabolic feedback to change behavior. CGMs, meal challenge tests, and simple post-meal glucose checks can be motivational for adults and help tailor meal composition to blunt spikes, especially useful for those with early insulin resistance. But use them as behavior change tools, not as permission to continue processed food intake. Repair the microbiome with diet first. High-fiber, polyphenol-rich foods, fermented foods, and avoidance of unnecessary antibiotics offer the safest route to restore microbial diversity. Consider targeted prebiotics/probiotics in selected cases, but expect variable results and demand quality evidence. Address hunger biology directly. If genetic or metabolic profiling shows high reward responsivity or rapid post-meal hunger, prioritize high-protein, high-fiber breakfasts, slower-release carbohydrates, and tactics that increase oral and gastric satiety, chewing, adding volume with vegetables, more intact foods. Behavioral therapies, CBT, mindful eating adapted to developmental stage, should be paired with biological strategies. Integrate lifestyle therapies. Exercise, including resistance training, sleep optimization, and stress reduction, alter metabolic set points, improve insulin sensitivity, and rebalance appetite hormones. These changes often outstrip the marginal gains from obscure genetic tweaks. Monitor objectively and longitudinally. Regular objective measures: weight, waist circumference, HbA1c, fasting lipids, CRP, perhaps body composition, provide clearer evidence of benefit than a one-off genetic report. Personalization should produce measurable improvements in health markers, not just interesting data points. Beware the commercial and ethical traps. Genetic and microbiome data are private health information. Tests vary in quality, and companies may overclaim benefits. Testing can increase health inequities. Only wealthier consumers can afford bespoke plans, while the structural drivers of ultra-processed food consumption, cost, marketing, availability, remain unaddressed. Insist on validated labs, clinical oversight, and transparent interpretation. There are also strong warnings that must be front and center. First, none of this should be used to justify continued high intake of ultra-processed foods by claiming "my biology needs them," or that a supplement will neutralize harm. That is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. Second, personalization can become a distraction. A well-designed public health approach reducing exposure to processed foods will have a far greater population benefit than individualized genomics for a few. Third, genetic and microbiome tests can cause psychological harm. Labeling, fatalism, anxiety, and unnecessary medicalization are real outcomes when data are presented without nuance. Fourth, many commercially available personalized recommendations are not clinically validated. Follow advice from qualified clinicians and registered dietitians who understand the limits of current evidence. Finally, equity and accessibility must guide deployment. Personalized nutrition risks widening disparities if only affluent people can afford tests and coaching. The most ethical application is to use these tools to prioritize resources, identifying those at highest risk who need intensive support while simultaneously advocating for environmental change, subsidies for healthy food, restrictions on predatory marketing, school food reform, and community interventions that make whole foods affordable and convenient. In short, genetics, microbiome profiles, and metabolic phenotyping can refine prevention strategies against the harms of ultra-processed foods and may improve outcomes for some individuals. But they are not magic bullets. The strongest, most reliable strategy remains structural. Reduce exposure to ultra-processed foods, make whole foods accessible and affordable, and pair modest personalization with proven lifestyle interventions, protein/fiber emphasis, sleep, exercise, stress management. Treat biological tests as tools for prioritization and motivation, not as permits to keep consuming highly processed, addictive products. Until the science matures and equity concerns are addressed, personalized nutrition should be used sparingly, transparently, and always alongside the blunt but effective approach. Eat less processed food, more real food, and measure the health outcomes that matter.